Hey guys, it's Briars. Just want to tell you what's going on down at Meltdown Comics in Hollywood. We got Meltthology. Meltthology is a monthly comics jam at Meltdown every third Tuesday of the month. Here's how it works. Show up at the Melt at 7 p.m. and draw a page of whatever you want. At 9:30 p.m., we'll collect all of the art and $3 for printing costs. When you come to the next month's comics jam, you'll get a zine with everyone's contributions inside. There is no set theme, and all skill levels are welcome. Last but not least, Meltthology contributors get 10% off their Meltdown purchase on the night of the event. Go to @Meltthology on Twitter or Facebook if you have any specific questions. Ask for Chuck, and that is @Melt_thology.
Hello and welcome back to Pod Sequentialism. I am your host, Matt Kennedy. We're taping here at Meltdown, so if you hear anything in the background that sounds a little crazy or loud or like maybe we're being applauded, that is possible, but it's also possible that there's another great event happening just around the corner. Now, today on the show, we're going to have a really great in-depth conversation with one of my favorite artists, contemporary artist named Christopher Ulrich, also a very good friend. You've heard him mentioned on this podcast in previous shows. And with Ave Rose, with Frank Forte, and why I thought it'd be really great to have Christopher on the show. Not technically a sequential artist, but I think it's going to be very inspirational when you hear just about where he's come from, what he's doing, where it goes, and how this can affect you in your quest to break into comics or just to appreciate them. So welcome to the show, Christopher Ulrich.
Thank you. It's nice to be here.
So we've known each other for quite a few years now. We figured out it's been about 7 years, I guess, in LA.
Yeah, can you imagine that?
I know, right? And one of the things that I think drew us into the same interests, and we're about the same age.
I believe so, yes.
Yeah. Aside from just the general interest in those things that most of us are into, if we're into any of this, comic books and horror films and fantasy literature and that type of thing. What makes you perhaps a little bit different is that your parents are European from Europe.
Yes, that's right.
And your dad is from Switzerland.
Mm-hmm.
And your mom is from France.
Yeah.
And so
I'm the first American in my family.
And so do you think that had a particular impact on maybe your exposure to the arts at a young age?
Well, that's a very interesting question. I don't necessarily know what doesn't have an impact. I mean, I remember the actual first impact I had was smell. Mm-hmm. My father had in the garage oil paints and an oil painting, and I remember smelling it, and that was one of my first real powerful experiences. And then he had a book on Rembrandt, and I was just, and then of course, then you go off and watch Scooby-Doo, and I had a collection of plastic sharks because I was really into Jaws. Yeah. So it's you have this whole weird mixture of Scooby-Doo, Rembrandt, and a great white shark, and you're well on your way into the arts.
Yeah. Well, for people who don't know, and we've touched on this in previous podcasts, but Christopher Ulrich is probably the best artist that you may not know about. He's a gracious guy. He's rolling his eyes when I say these things. But a lot of his contemporaries have turned to him for advice on technique or in kind of straightening out the narrative to the work. And he's been a very giving instructor. And he has a lot of formal training. And I guess we should probably talk about that, there's no shortcut to greatness. And I remember having a conversation with Lori Lipton, and people always come up to her and they ask her, what's the trick?
Inspiration.
What's the trick?
Yeah.
And she says, the trick is that I've done absolutely nothing except draw for the last 30 years.
Yeah, that's right.
I don't leave my room. She was for a very long time basically living upstairs in a church in England and producing this incredibly tight work. And that's kind of the rule and not the exception, that you need training, you need to paint every single day, and you have to work to make your technique better. But tell me a little bit about that. Where do you think that At what point did you start to realize, hey, I think I have a knack for this, and then decide to take it a little bit further?
Oh, I don't, for me, I never have that feeling.
You never?
No, I never have that feeling. I have a knack for it or, I mean, that's something that's later associated with you. I think it starts with just a commitment or just a desire or a need. And perhaps those things backwards, it first starts with the need. I remember, there's some kids scribbling on paper and some get off and do something else and some start to see something in the scribble. And perhaps there's a dialogue there that begins, and it's not just you're expressing yourself, but the very thing that you're doing begins to talk to you, or you begin to have this dialogue. I mean, it's a very odd way of putting it, but what I'm saying is that, it's mysterious in that regard where, you get inspired or you see something that doesn't exist and you scribble it down. And then you struggle because it looks like a mess. And then you see what other people can do and you're just, they're like magicians. You're like just amazed that they can draw and they can tell stories and they can make imagery. And, for me, it was my absolute, way of expressing myself. It was my prime way of expressing myself. And also learning. And I had a hard time at the beginning learning as other kids would, I always was the last one in the spelling bee or something like this. For me, letters were pictures. And you grow from it, and you meet incredible people, and you meet masters, and we'll go down all that line. And and then you meet people that were just like you, and then suddenly you realize that there's something more happening here than just you scribbling or painting or whatnot, that you're in some kind of labyrinth.
I think there's something that you don't hear addressed too often. And being the child of immigrants, if you grow up in a household where English is spoken and English is the second language, that you grow up with your ear accustomed to an accent. And so especially when you're young and you're in school, you bring that accent with you to class. And depending on what the mechanical, racial percentage is in the area that you grow up in, you may be the only person that sounds like that. I know I've got friends that grew up north of Boston who were Vietnamese and who were Dominican in a largely white neighborhood. And so there was the challenge of finding their own method of speech. But I think that that's one thing, that's one step away from discovering who you are that maybe most people don't experience immediately. That gives you an automatic level of separation, which can, in a way, help you in a good way, in an empowering way, but not always, develop back into, okay, well, this is my inner dialogue, and I'm going to create this. And that can be a way of either coping with sounding different or with having a completely different experience. I mean, the other thing is that if you grow up in Texas, and for miles around, everybody has, whether they're Southern Baptists or something, if you are the Catholic kid or the Jewish kid or the Buddhist kid that grows up in an environment that is of a completely different spiritual belief system, then that is also something which is a little bit different. And so your view of the world that everybody else that's standing right beside you for 6 hours a day in a schoolroom, that those differences become paramount to you personally. Do you think that in any way was indicative of your creative expression, or do you think it's completely unrelated?
Well, let's just take let's just take it from this point of view. Let's just say, for example, that it's meaningful the place that you were born in.
Yeah.
Let's just go from that assumption. Not like that it's all random, but let's look at it from a fun, creative point of view. I was very fortunate to be in Los Angeles.
Mm-hmm.
I was very fortunate. Even though I was kind of disconnected from whatever lineage that my parents came from, during that time in Los Angeles, which was like during the 70s and 80s, I mean, it was goodness.
Wow.
So it's
Who knew the 80s would get such a scream?
yes. Well, it's nice to see the Phantoms are with us.
Yes.
As a kid, I was just, I was largely on my own to discover things.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't really have a very strong cultural enforcement. You know what I mean? It was kind of, you were on your own. And I remember.
Well, now they'd call that free range parenting.
Yes.
But in the 70s when we grew up, it was just called parenting.
Yes. So, I remember being fascinated by a variety of things, and I was really into Egyptian mythology, and there was that Tutankhamun exhibition at
in
LACMA.
1976 in Boston.
I was just begging my father to take me to it. I was also, for some reason, put into Catholic school.
Mm-hmm.
I went to Catholic elementary school, and I didn't know this at the time, but my father is like Protestant. He's not even Catholic. But I guess I was, his business partner that he came over to the States with, his sons were in this school, so I followed them. And I just remember with that whole mixture of things, I really began on this, real incredible journey. I remember going into the garden and seeing this, statue of this woman stepping on a snake. And I thought that was the coolest thing I ever seen. I didn't know it was like the Virgin Mary and all this sort of stuff, you know what I mean? I just thought this woman crushing a snake. I mean, it was like, what is that?
The Virgin Mary as proto-feminist art object is probably a pretty fascinating springboard.
It's interesting when you look at it with an undogmatic mind, and you look at it purely, fresh. And I like not knowing what the thing was intended to be. I like discovering what it's telling me that it is.
Right.
It's always nice later to learn, but, I was just fascinated by the imagery. I remember being in the church and I was never bored. I thought it was, later there was aspects to it I'm like not into, but, as far as the stained glass and all this type of stuff, I mean, it was like, what is all this, I just always was interested in how do you make that?
Well, it's interesting too, because growing up, and I also grew up in a Catholic household, so that, the stained glass of the church was, to me, a giant comic book, because all those stained glass were, the Stations of the Cross and everything. And it was great if you saw it lit in the afternoon with the sun coming through the glass. It had a very different look than if you were in church at night and the light was illuminating outward. But that, without maybe belaboring the point, that that there is a certain education that is inherent if you are in a Catholic school. And you didn't just go to Catholic elementary school. You ended up learning painting from the Jesuits too, right, in college.
Well, yeah, I mean, I went to Loyola Marymount University. At that time, after high school, I did want to go to art school, but there was not a lot of support for that. My father was not into that. He did not want me to pursue the arts at all. He wanted, from his perspective, he had worked really hard. He wanted me to follow in opportunities that he didn't have. Like, he wanted me to, I basically was a doctor or a lawyer.
Right.
Choose one or something like that. Just typical story. And so I went to, Loyola Marymount, and I studied psychology, but I also pursued basically my degree in art. And what was interesting was, while I was there, I met a professor who was basically an actual working, breathing artist. He had a studio, he sold paintings, and he was a real inspiration. And I remember, realizing that if this is something I want to do, I really have, I didn't know the first thing. So I remember, instead of going to my graduation, wearing that black hat and all this sort of thing, I was in a studio learning how to stretch canvases, and he gave me a very traditional and very difficult kind of apprenticeship. He was a real hardcore mentor, to say the least. I mean, there was no messing around. So, and from him, he was an art center graduate. And, I got to learn a lot of things by being at that studio. And, there's so many different types of knowledges that you have to have than just, learning how to paint. You can put a bowl of lemons in front of you, but, you have to know so much more. And I got a very, very interesting education. But in the end, I think the greatest teacher for me, what I would tell anybody, is your sketchbook. I mean, those are my treasures. A sketchbook is one of the most important tools that I know of. If you're going to go on this journey, first thing you got to do is you got to religiously start keeping a sketchbook.
No pun intended.
Well, you have to be devoted. I mean, I definitely think, one of the things my mentor told me was, if you can do something else, do it. Because this is not something that eventually you're going to have to work when you're not in the mood to work. You're going to have to work when you feel like dog meat. And, that's just actually part of the real commitment.
And I'm going to break the continuity here for a second. And again, because I think a lot of people that will be listening to this podcast won't be familiar with you. And maybe while they're listening to this, they'll Google you and they'll see images on your website. But that there's a long line that stretches from the point where you start to create art and where you start to create things that you think you want to be what you do. Certainly when I was a young kid and I used to sketch with my friends, I thought it'd just be absolutely great to be a comic book artist someday. And as I got older and I realized that my chops weren't there and that perhaps my talents lied in a different line, that there were people who could do it better than I could. And I embraced the opportunity to work with people who I thought were more suited to that activity. But that, not so long ago, there was an exhibition in Mesa, Arizona.
Yes.
That included your 16-foot by 8-foot tall Last Supper painting, in which you've replaced the apostles with all the other sun gods. And it's an incredibly rich portrait, but it's also alchemically important. It's also a kind of mystical work. It's in no way dismissive of the Christian idolatry, if you will, I guess, of the original painting of the Da Vinci Last Supper portrait. That there's reverence, but there's a different point of view. And what you talked about is that it is important to see all aspects of everything, but to you scribble and then you see something in the scribble, that the work that you create takes on a life of its own and it becomes this other thing, and you have to be open to experiencing that, but you have to be confident enough to be able to put it all down on canvas or on paper or whatever the format that you use. If you're a sculptor, to put it down in ceramics. If you're working digitally, then to expand your rudimentary horizons to allow
absolutely.
something new to come into it. Now, this is a long trek. This wasn't something that happened overnight. This is, and to a great degree, you are now entering the beginning of a career that has been happening for quite a long time, but that it's really hitting that stage where people are beginning to become aware of who you are, that different types of work that you've done in different avenues have started to reach people. One of the people that you went to elementary school with would become a future collaborator. Yes.
Well, you touched upon a lot of things. I mean, I think that for me, having an art career has been a byproduct. It wasn't in some ways, if you're going to pursue a career in the arts, you don't do what I do.
Yeah.
But at the same time, doing work, it's really fascinating because you can do the work where you're actually, wanting to promote and to get your skill out there. You know, you do something, you do it well, you do it enough times where you polish it out and you get it out there and you get known for doing that, and then you do similar things to that. And, you know, I understand that model. It's a very smart model. And, you know, but if you're actually doing the work in a way where it's a mystery and you're discovering it, and it's you know, you begin to feel that it's telling you to do this or telling you to do that, you go down a very different kind of road. And, you know, when I met you, this was what I was doing. I was basically really trying to find or, you know, discover and have an experience, not just make imagery, but to have it be more of something of a living thing. For me, the process. That's why I would, you know, document all the notes, chart the way I'm thinking.
And people who who aren't familiar, Ulrich's process work produces a copious amount of very detailed large format drawings, collage work where it's almost a spiritual map of the origin of the image that it references, combined with sometimes sacred, sometimes secular writing. A lot of the various influences from various media become a part of this mapped out, graphed out preliminary drawing. And sometimes it's 20 preliminary drawings that are very large format and very detailed as the piece changes when you start to pull in or to extract a new specific jump off point for the portrait that you're working on. And I've seen you come to near completion on a painting and then stop and then go back and do it again, changing a very important element that completely changes the context of the story that's being told, but you can see where it came from. There's a lineage. There's like, if it were on glass plates, you could stack them up like an encyclopedia or human atlas.
I definitely think some of my best work is hidden. It's underneath the surfaces. I mean, that's just...
And some's in the back.
Yes, I for me, I had the opportunity of working at the Norton Simon Museum, and I remember at one point I got to actually go down into the vault, and I got to take, paintings off the racks and off the walls, and I was just fascinated by the history of the notes on the back of the paintings, where they had been, and especially the older the painting, oftentimes, more notes were behind it.
And a lot of people are completely unaware of this. Most people who walk into a museum just see the portrait in the frame hanging on the wall and are completely, maybe blissfully unaware that there's anything on the back of that canvas. And so having access to that is sort of like having, keys to a hole in your living room under the rug that you didn't know was there. And there's this amazing other world down there. I mean, it's like Pan's Labyrinth.
I definitely think that, for me, art is, it's sacred, which means it has no value. It's valueless. You can't put value on something that's sacred because it's beyond value. Mm-hmm. But obviously we live in the society that we live in, but there have been many cultures throughout history that have made work for an entirely different reasons than to, be able to pay your rent. Mm. They made work for invisible universes that we don't even know or don't even believe exist anymore. Mm. They did it for gods and goddesses that have long now been, reclaimed by the earth and have been forgotten, and so there's this wonderful cycle that we are engaged in which we forget and we remember. And I think that when you're doing the kind of work where you're diving deep into, the imagery and drawing points of connection and graphing, part of it is purging, part of it is, actually finding connection. And I'm just so interested in that, and then you say, well, how do you make that viable? So everyone has to create a system for themselves of how they achieve a goal. you know. And for me, when I met you, I began these 3 major series. You know, I had done the Demon Eater, and then with you, we did the other 2, and
Illuminator and
the
the
Illuminator
Reckoning.
and the Reckoning, and that was all the things that I learned along the way by doing those things was pretty amazing.
Mm-hmm. Now, what's interesting is, you know, and we were tackling kind of a pretty heavy subject, which is when you are creating large format fine art pieces, it can seem difficult for someone to look at that and see that there's a huge influence of comic books underneath all of this,
Oh yeah,
you know, incredible fine painting. And
I remember the Savage Sword of Conan as a kid.
yeah.
I mean, that was like treasure. That was treasure to get your hands on that.
Mm-hmm.
I, you know, obviously, you know, I mentioned my cousin before. He, you know, I remember him drawing a comic,
Mm-hmm.
and I thought it was the most incredible thing you could ever do. I remember a drawing to this day he did of his main character was basically Conan.
Yeah.
Chopping a lizard man in half. I thought it was the coolest, you know, and that's where it begins right there, you know.
And you've been able to, in the last couple of years, come full circle with that. We touched on the fact that, you know, one of your fellow elementary school students went on a completely different kind of career path. And then I think as a result of one of the shows that we had, I think it was the 4th Enoki and Key show, which was at Billy Shire Fine Arts, that Nimrod got back in touch with you.
Yes, Nimrod and Guido. Nimrod Antol and Guido Martini. Boy, I tell you, the turnaround and see them. And it was really, it's a great story because Nimrod had in his hands a drawing that I had done when we were in school together. We were kids. And he had apparently, of all the things that he had purged in his life, he still had this drawing. And
Talk about, what are a couple of Nimrod's films?
oh my goodness. Well, he did a wonderful film called Control. It's a Hungarian film, and it's incredible. And I remember seeing that film, and I didn't even realize he had made it. And it's just, when I put the two together, it was just incredibly meaningful to me. He's also done Predators, Armored, Vacancy, he did the Metallica
Through the Never. And you worked on that as well.
Yes, I actually got the storyboard for that. That was such an experience. He had me storyboard that. And
that's kind of great that this is the show that is after Frank Forte's show. He storyboarding for Bob's Burgers, and he's got the new show Emoji through Sony, which I don't think we got to touch on, but that two of you who have such completely different styles and really completely different backgrounds wind up doing the same job. Now, I remember talking to Nimrod, and especially about, having you on set to do this, and you coming to him and saying, oh, I don't think I got that much done today. And him turning and shaking his head incredulously. It's like, well, you did 10 pages of continuity today when I think the average is 1.5 to 3 pages, but having no frame of reference because the amount of images you're producing in your head that have to make it through your hand to hit the graphite, to hit the paper can be a level of frustration. I think that's an issue that a lot of people who have problems producing, and this is, of course, the most sequential art you can produce, is to do a shot list for a director.
Well, working for him is really special because, we did basically what we did as kids, where he would do a sketch and then I would elaborate on it. Mm-hmm. And, a lot of the storyboarding with him, he's such an amazing creator that he makes actually very accurate sketches. And it's misleading. If you look at it, you think, oh, it seems simple, but it isn't. The absolute angle is correct. And so I got to, working with him so closely and burning through a lot of pencils.
Yeah.
It was a lot of fun, really incredible. And also to be able to be a little bit in his world and to see how he paints with people, like a huge. I mean, a film is like a grand tapestry of moving parts and requires, an entirely different skill.
Emotion mosaic.
Yes, and it's just amazing to have, worked on that project and met, all those people that I got to meet. And
to be working on a Metallica project. I mean, when you talk about going
I
back to being 13.
I actually got to see my first Metallica concert in Vancouver. That was an experience. That was something else. They are pretty incredible.
And working with the future Green Goblin at that point. Although it seems like that franchise is going to get brushed under the rug. But by Sony, I think that they're going to relaunch Spider-Man again already after only 2 films. But that to see, especially it's interesting to see as an artist who's creating something completely from scratch most of the time, like literally from scratch. Yeah. To work in an environment where there are so many people working on one thing.
Yes, it's completely different. It's like being turned inside out.
But that also changed the way you paint a little bit.
Well, I think every project you do, especially something that grand, changes you forever. Mm-hmm. I mean, I remember Nimrod telling me that these experiences do change you, and he was completely correct. I mean, they open you up. They show your strengths and your weaknesses. And I think that that's what making great art should really be. It should really be, you should be always in some way vulnerable and willing to be vulnerable, because it's only by having that lack of protection that and yes, there are many hits you take, but man, the insight and the power that you gain from that, they say that the spirit grows from a wound. Yeah. And there are some people that waste so much time and energy projecting some kind of, superiority or some kind of invulnerability. And, I just don't have time for that. I really don't have any time for, that kind of nonsense. I mean, there's something in alchemy where you burn something to a crisp and you keep destroying it. And then when what's ever left, you destroy that as well. And then you think, wait a minute, I'm supposed to be an artist. I'm supposed to be creating. And half the time, I feel like I'm destroying things, especially as you've mentioned earlier, how you'll see me work on the walls or on the canvases and, I completely obliterate it. But that's what it's about, editing. And you only edit when you realize that, I'm going away from my original intention, or my intention has changed and I've discovered something deeper.
There's got to be something kind of personally gratifying too about being an artist who there's got to be something, personally gratifying too about, here's a guy who in 1995 walks into the San Diego Comicon with a portfolio.
Oh my goodness,
of
this
drawings,
is a great story.
And walks up and shows a few artists and just gets torn to pieces. As I think everybody who's ever done this has.
I've failed in a number of ways, and I continue to fail. So a fool who continues. What was the saying? That the fool who what was that saying? Anyway, it doesn't matter. But the point is, I've always wanted to make comics, and I've always wanted to make games, and I have failed in those miserably. And it's to a great extent, and I love it.
But that's
I keep trying it.
That's also changing. So I mean, here you go, and I'll finish the thought. Is that why it has to be very personally gratifying? Is that 20 years, almost to the day, from the last Comicon, you went to this year's Comicon.
Yes.
And you had, with you, completed sketches of a toy line which is going to go into production, for the Dementoids, another project that you worked on with
George
Nimrod.
and George and Aileen from October Toys.
Yeah. And simultaneously are muraling a theme bar in Pasadena.
Yes.
That serves Bavarian Fair, and you created a complete mythology for the walls that is going to be documented, released in a book. We'll have there's a film associated with the making of that. You've come off just 2 years prior working on a major motion picture with Metallica, probably, one of the most iconic heavy metal bands. And then, by the time this podcast is broadcast, on the stands will be an issue of Heavy Metal Magazine with 8 pages of your artwork in it.
Yes, you make it sound very luxurious, but thank you. That's
well,
awesome.
I think that there's a lot of people who they take a failure not as a learning experience or as something to take forward, but as a failure, and it becomes this insurmountable impasse where that they feel a little browbeaten. And I think that anybody who has gone to art school has a little bit of a thicker skin about this.
I think so. I think I'm very fortunate in that regard. I mean, when I use the word failure, I mean more like, imagine you have a cauldron in front of you and you keep trying to, concoct a spell, and you keep getting this wonderful colored smoke, popped into your face. And the joy is, creating something that becomes alive. I mean, I remember being in 1995 at the first, comic book and, Comicon with my little sketchbook, as you said. And I remember seeing for the first time a picture of Hellboy.
We'll clarify, your first Comicon.
Yeah, my first, that's what I meant. Yes, my first Comicon. Well, there were no Comicons, by the way, that existed before that.
Before you walked
obviously.
Into the hall, yes.
So, but I remember seeing for the first time a picture of Hellboy. And I didn't even know what Hellboy was. I didn't even know that those were horns, those discs on his head.
Yeah.
I was so perplexed, and
like, why is he wearing goggles that are above his head?
Yeah, and then to see what it would turn into, and then and then you mentioned now 20 years later, going again to Comic-Con and getting to do a piece for a Del Toro show and a little Kronos piece because I love that movie. And it's just, we're a part of this history. We're not just outside it. I think that a lot of times when someone is young and full of hopes and dreams and has been initiated into this mystery, you sometimes feel like you're on the outside of things. But I really do believe it's a labyrinth. You have beginners that enter into it, and you have veterans, you have people who have made a certain comfortable niche in certain part of the labyrinth and stay there. But the point of it in the end,
every labyrinth needs a minotaur.
Well, that's sometimes the thing that you either are going towards or avoid most.
Yeah.
And that's at the center. And you always have to find what your center is, and you always have to find what you were meant to make. I think that everybody is meant to make something. And I think if you persevere, despite handicaps, misfortune, just one thing you got to do is you got to get out the thing that you were meant to create. I really do believe that everyone was meant to create something. And I think some people have turned their back on that and are, outright killers. And that's a whole nother discussion. But I think in the end, you should never diss somebody at the end of the line or some young fresh face or something with some eager little book, because have you ever seen the sketch of Kermit the Frog on it's like a little sketch? I mean, that character changed the world.
Yeah.
I mean, it's amazing to be a part of this thing.
I've always said that if it wasn't for Carl Sagan,
oh yeah,
and Jim Henson, I don't know what I would have learned.
You see right there when you say that, I got chills down my whole arm. I mean, Carl Sagan for me was such a pioneer, a mind opener. I mean, I love space. I love the beauty of space. I'm intrigued by it. And then puppets, space and puppets. I mean, you just don't get better than that.
Yeah, Jim Henson and Carl Sagan were hugely influential on exciting my generation about learning, and it's different now. I mean, there's a lot more noise. There's certainly more than 4 or 5 channels on every television now, and so I think it's it would behoove parents to maybe curate what it is that their kids get to watch.
It's not just the channels, it's the technology. I mean, I see so many young kids with these, the iPhones and these things, and they're just kind of, swirling it with their finger and all this. And, it's an entirely different phenomenon. I remember when you and I were kids, we had a bicycle.
Yeah.
Then if you want to change the screen, you had to ride to the next block, and around every corner was something that could, and then when you went to go see a film, like I remember seeing Dark Crystal, and I was just, speaking of Henson and I mean, just being blown away, and this like, I guess knowledge was harder to come by. And it was at our time,
and more appreciated because of it.
Yeah, and now we are in an age in which literally the times of the Library of Alexandria have returned. I mean, you have virtually more knowledge at your fingertips than any other previous generation ever had, ever. The amount of power an individual person has today is extraordinary. If you've ever done any kind of, imagination or history or, learned about things long ago, I mean, they had different advantages actually, but they had major disadvantages.
Yeah.
And, this is the fascinating thing about, the generations is that you're one of them.
Yeah, there's a different culture of individuality now, in that when in the pre-internet age, and the irony being, of course, that anybody who's listening to this is listening to it on online.
Yeah.
That obviously this could not have existed in an age past, but that you learned something because you were interested. You got interested because you found it, sometimes by accident, sometimes because it was exposed to you, and you would follow that line down. That meant going to the library. That meant, trying to find access to that greater well of information any way that you could. And now it's certainly a lot easier, but I think that the way things have improved is that it's not as easy, and in a good way, for a person to remain completely alone. But I mean, in that you can find your tribe online. By searching for certain things, you can find a lot of people who are into those things. Because people have access to more information, there's a lot more specialized information available that can unite people, that can bring people together, and can bring collaborators together. The downside is the quality of that information can be exaggerated. That it is much more difficult to differentiate between good information and bad information, and that you can also have the type of individuality that you have in Japan, where you can be in an intersection with 400,000 people, none of whom are paying any attention to the other people around them at all. That you can become, even in a large group of people, completely alone and completely isolated. But the cultural difference of that aside, I think that the expansion in a way through this technology can be helpful in a way that we never imagined, and slightly harmful in a way that we probably did.
Well, like with all things, I mean, for instance, I love the name of this show, I believe, this pod sequentialism, because like right there, what does that mean to me? It's like metamorphosis, like a pod. You're in a cocoon, and you go through these different stages. I think it's very harmful if you stay at a particular stage.
Right.
At some point, you have to break the pod, and you have to actually go travel. If you're always traveling via on the screen or whatever, or virtually, there's harm there. I mean, you have to, there's a great benefit to actually go to a library. Mm-hmm. I've had very bizarre experiences in a library. In fact, the best thing about going to a library is not the research you're doing or the book you find. It's some weird random person you bump into or some strange event you witness. I mean, knowledge is never ultimately just what you're seeking. It's what happens to you as you seek it. It's all the things that you didn't expect to discover And as an artist, you have to, for my opinion, you have to be adventurous. You have to really have guts. I mean, and you got to go into the dark cave. You got to go to the country you don't know anything about. You gotta withstand watching your friends, get jobs and have babies and you know what I mean, while you're still trying to do the very thing you were always trying to do since you were a kid. In some ways you're stunted. So you have to do things that augment that, and you have to interact with people and more importantly, you have to balance that with you have to produce and create an intimate time with your own self that you can actually produce things. And I think that it takes a lot of different types of combinations of things, but you don't need to think about all this. All you need to think about is, what is this thing that I was so inspired when I heard about the author of the Harry Potter. I learned about Harry Potter because I was actually teaching kids art, or being taught by them how to teach them. And I remember they all had these books, these Harry Potter books, and I would Rowling, correct, as the author, and she was like a waitress, on welfare, and
living in her car, I believe.
And you think about how many people make an excuse about like not being too tired to draw when they come home, or too tired. Of course you're too tired, but if you have this need, this story, what's so fascinating is it just might be real. And what I mean by real, meaning not just an extension or manifestation of your ego, but actually something that has its own life. And in that regard, more substantial, because it will then change your life. A lot of people, if they have a success and they create something that just catches fire and that people love, it's very easy for you to say, oh, that's me. No, people don't love you. They love this thing you created.
That's the zeitgeist, the aggregate of the information, the metadata. Yeah.
And, in many ways, this is channeling. You channel this stuff. I mean, where do these things come from? Where does the idea come from? What is an idea? And you have a lot of people have a different opinion on that. Art is always the secondary concept that always leads you into what was behind it, which is this thing was felt before it was created. This thing was, like you just gave me this wonderful book on Frazetta, and late last night when I was working, I sat down and I opened up the book to that Death Dealer.
Yeah.
And I remember as a kid at Oktoberfest, it was autumn, Halloween, and I remember seeing that image on I think it was a poster. And I'm telling you, my imagination went right through the roof. And, it's a masterpiece. That's a masterpiece that can do that. It's greater than the sum total of its parts.
Well, I think that's a pretty great place to end. And but before we go, I want to give people an opportunity to be able to find your work. We've talked about a few things, but where can people find you online?
ChristopherUlrich.com is my website. And then there's various galleries, like La Luz de Jesus. You can go there and, scroll back into some of the past shows. And, 2012, that's a good year to start, December. That's the Chronic Crater series.
The Reckoning that was the Reckoning.
It was the Reckoning, which I'm glad we did talk about.
And we've also got a set of murals that will have reached completion by the time this podcast airs in Pasadena. Yeah,
at the Wolfkopf in Pasadena on the corner of Union and Fair Oaks. That's a wonderful project. Illustrating or painting a mythology in a bar, and it's pretty cool.
Excellent. Well, again, I want to thank my guest, Christopher Ulrich. I want to thank my listeners. This has been Pod Sequentialism. I am Matt Kennedy, and we'll hit you up next time.
Bye-bye.
Melt You, the school at Meltdown, where they teach you the skills to make comic books. Some of the current classes include creating comics, drawing comics for kids, and the art of inking. Coming soon, there will be classes for short film writing, drawing basics, and kids make zines. Go to meltcomics.com and enroll now.